Clara Dunley, 20 years old, pressed her back against the rough slats of the boxcar, trying to keep her youngest sister from coughing. The straw beneath them stank of manure and rot, soaked with old blood and fresh urine. Ellie's head lay in her lap, feverish and limp, her tiny hands curled like a sparrow caught in wire. June sat across from them, 16 and silent, her dress torn and eyes too old for her face. The train jolted again, wheels grinding over sun-scorched rails somewhere in Arizona territory. No windows, just slivers of light breaking through the wooden cracks above their heads, sharp enough to blind, useless for escape. Clara had stopped counting days after the third night. She'd memorized the rhythm of the men outside instead. Their boots, their laughter, the clang of tin cups, and the slurred curses that followed whiskey. They called themselves railroad men, wore badges stitched with lies, and polished pistols they never bothered to fire. The one with the gold tooth had set it straight to her face that first night when they locked the doors. "You'll fetch more if you look pretty. Keep the little one quiet. No one likes a screamer." Clara had slapped him. The others laughed. That was when she stopped being a girl. She held Ellie tighter now, running her fingers through the child's dusty hair. The girl hadn't eaten in a day and hadn't spoken in 2. The fever had come quick and hard. Too much sun, too little water. The tin cup they passed through the slat hadn't come today. She could hear June murmuring something under her breath, a prayer maybe, or just her own name, trying not to forget it. Clara's fingers found the splintered edge of the boxcar wall. She began sawing the pad of her thumb across it, just enough to feel pain, not enough to bleed. It was the only thing left she could control. Outside footsteps approached. One of the men. Boots dragged in the dirt, spurs catching on the gravel. Then silence. A rusted key scraped into the lock. June stiffened. Ellie whimpered. The door creaked open a hand's width. A shaft of light spilled across the straw. Clara braced herself, shielding her sisters. But it wasn't the gold-toothed man. It wasn't one of them. The boots were worn, dusty, the silhouette lean, tall. A rifle slung over one shoulder, not pointed, resting like it belonged there. The man stepped forward, just enough for Clara to see his face. Dark eyes, weathered skin. A scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw like a knife had tried to teach him silence and failed. He didn't speak, just looked at the girls, one by one. And then he said, quiet but certain, "They're not cattle." He lifted the rifle from his back, and everything changed. Elias Boon had ridden half the night, with only the moon to guide him and the ache in his shoulder to remind him he was still human. The desert was a quiet place, unless you knew how to listen. The creak of iron on iron, the hiss of steam without whistle. A train stalled where no station stood. It wasn't right. He dismounted at the ridge just before dawn, boots sinking into red dust. His horse snorted, uneasy, and he murmured something low in Cheyenne, calming it. Below, the train sat like a carcass in the sand. No lanterns, no guards, no reason, just metal and shadows. He adjusted the rifle across his back and walked slow, deliberate, past the engine and its rusted wheels, past the boxcars that should have carried timber or cattle or sacks of flour. But this one smelled wrong. The sound came as he passed it, a cough, faint and raw, like something trapped. He stopped. Then came the whisper. Too small to be a man, too soft to be made up. Elias stepped closer, resting a palm on the hot wood. He listened. Another whisper. Not English, not Cheyenne, just pain. He stepped back, lifted the butt of his rifle, and brought it down hard on the rusted lock. Once, twice. The latch snapped. The door groaned open an inch, then wider. They were huddled in straw and filth, faces smudged, eyes wide and hollow. One girl looked barely 10, her cheeks burning with fever. Another, mid-teens maybe, sat like stone, hands clenched around her knees. The third stood between them, shoulders squared like she'd been holding up the world alone and was ready to do it again. Elias didn't move. He just looked at them. Not like a man, not like a marshal, like someone remembering something he thought he'd buried years ago. His sister's face flashed in his mind. Younger than the oldest girl, throat bruised, dress torn, buried on a hill with no marker. The men who'd taken her had smiled when they swung from the gallows, but the smile had stayed with him longer. He looked away, swallowed the heat in his throat. Behind him, a boot scraped gravel. The gold-toothed bastard stepped from the shadows with a revolver half raised and a smirk on his face. "Marshal," he drawled, "this ain't your concern." Elias turned slowly, rifle lowered but ready. His eyes said everything. "I reckon it is now." The man hesitated. Elias didn't. One shot. Clean. Quiet. The body hit the ground without ceremony. Dust rose and settled like breath exhaled. He turned back to the girls, crouched low now, voice steady. "You're coming with me." The oldest girl didn't move. "You a good man?" she asked. "No," Elias said, "but I ain't him." And for the first time, her shoulders lowered, just a little. The desert didn't ask questions in the dark. It just swallowed noise and secrets like it always had. Elias Boon moved fast through the train yard, coat trailing behind him like a shadow. The boxcar door was open now, the lock hanging loose, the three girls standing in the threshold like ghosts waiting for permission to haunt the earth again. Clara had Ellie in her arms. June clutched a rusted horseshoe like it might save her. "We go now," Elias said, his voice like gravel rubbed through silence. Clara hesitated. "What about the others?" "They don't wake up," he said flatly, checking the chambers of his Colt. The stars above them were cold and sharp. No moon. Just the kind of black sky that made you forget the world was ever bright. Elias led them around the engine, past two sleeping forms wrapped in blankets near the fire pit. He paused. Two men. Same ones who'd laughed when Clara had begged for water. Same ones who'd slammed the door after Ellie collapsed. He didn't wait. 2 shots, one to the head, one through the chest. Quick, precise. Like prayers whispered to the only God Elias ever believed in, justice without mercy. The girls flinched, but they didn't scream. Not even Ellie. They moved like smoke through the scrub, boots sinking into sand, breath tight and shallow. Elias had cached a horse and a mule a quarter-mile west, just over the dry wash. The mule would carry the girls, the horse would carry him. If they were lucky, they'd be 10 miles out before first light. They weren't lucky. A shout rang out behind them, then gunfire. Elias didn't flinch, just spun and fired twice more. A figure dropped in the distance. The rest didn't follow. Too afraid to chase a man they didn't understand. By the time they reached the ridge, Ellie was asleep against Clara's chest, and June was shaking from the cold she wouldn't admit to. Elias wrapped his coat around her without a word. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. They kept riding. By dawn, the hills were bleeding gold. In a saloon 50 miles east, a poster was being nailed to a wall, fresh ink, government seal. Wanted, Elias Boon, marshal turned fugitive, armed and dangerous. Wanted for theft of state cargo, and obstruction of federal commerce. Last seen fleeing with 3 female wards of the territory. Reward: $200, dead or alive. The bartender looked up from polishing a glass. "State cargo?" he asked the man in the gray suit. The man didn't smile. 3 girls, orphans, scheduled for transfer to licensed hospitality services. "Brothel," the bartender muttered. The man adjusted his cuffs. "You say brothel. We say commerce." In the desert, Elias slowed his horse and looked back once. No dust trail, no riders yet, but they would come. He didn't care. He had 3 girls who deserved better, and a gun that didn't believe in second chances. Clara watched him from across the fire, her arms wrapped around Ellie like a shield that never slept. The flames cracked and danced between them, throwing shadows on the canyon walls. Elias sat with his back to a rock, rifle across his lap, eyes never still. He hadn't spoken much since night fell. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. He hadn't tied them up, hadn't told them to be quiet or grateful. Just pointed west and said, "We ride till the sun says stop." Clara didn't trust him. She couldn't. Not after what had been done to them. She'd learned too much about the way men could smile while making monsters of themselves. Elias Boon didn't smile. And that, somehow, unsettled her more. She still saw it, how he'd pulled the trigger without flinching. Not with rage, not with joy. Just something colder, calculated, like he'd been born with the gun in his hand. Now he sat in that stillness, one ear tilted toward the wind, boots unmoving, mouth set in stone. A ghost with a badge that no longer meant anything. "He doesn't sleep," June whispered beside her. Clara shushed her, but her eyes didn't leave him. The canyon walls around them were tight, jagged, colored like rust and bone. No light reached them but the stars and the fire. Clara had chosen the wall at her back deliberately, the same way she chose to sleep with a blade beneath her blanket now. Ellie stirred in her arms, half dreaming, half burning from a fever still not broken. The sound of stones scraping caught her attention. Clara tensed, but it was just Elias, standing, walking toward them with slow, quiet steps. He crouched near June, pulled a flint from his coat, and knelt by the edge of the fire. He looked at Ellie, then at Clara. "She'll need warmth through the night." Clara said nothing. Her fingers clutched the knife under her shawl. He ignored the tension and set down a strip of cedar bark and dried grass. "You learn this," he said to June. "You won't die out here." June blinked, confused, but leaned closer. He struck steel to flint once. Nothing. Twice. A spark. The third time, the tinder flared to life like it had been waiting for him. He handed her the flint. "You try." June looked at Clara, who said nothing, then tried. The first strike failed. The second made a spark. On the 5th, a tiny flame danced. Elias gave the smallest nod. "Good." He stood, returned to his post, and faded again into stillness. June stared at the flicker she'd made, lips parting in something close to wonder. Clara kept her eyes on the man by the rock. He hadn't asked for anything. Not their thanks. Not their names. Not their faith. But that night, when the wind howled through the cliffs and the fire burned low, Clara realized something that made her chest ache. Ghosts don't run. And maybe, just maybe, they protect the living. The town of Bitter Mesa looked like it had been built out of apology and left to bake in the sun. One main street, 2 wells, and buildings sagging from heat and memory. Dust clung to everything, boots, skin, even breath. But Elias Boon rode in straight-backed and slow, like a man returning to a place that had once seen him bleed and hadn't quite decided if it was glad he lived. Clara kept the girls close, June riding behind her on the mule, Ellie swaying with fever in front. She didn't like the way people stared from shaded porches and crooked windows. A woman sweeping dirt from a doorway paused mid-motion. A boy dropped a tin pail and ran. Elias stopped near the old livery, dismounted, and handed the reins to a man who hadn't aged a day since the last time he'd seen him. "Still breathing, Red," Elias said. The stableman spit into the dirt. "Didn't think I'd see you again. Not after that mess with Sheriff Carr." "That mess saved a life," Elias said, unbothered. "Damn near cost you yours." Elias looked back at the girls. That habit seems to be sticking. Red's eyes followed the mule, his gaze landing on the smallest girl, then narrowing. "Who are they?" "Trouble," Elias said, "but not the kind that deserves to die in a boxcar." That earned him a longer look. Then Red just nodded once. "Back of the stable. Got an old tack room with shade. You need water. Speak to Martha. But don't linger long, Boon. Some men out here still remember the blood in the street." "I ain't looking to cause more." "Trouble don't care what you're looking for." They moved slow through the alley behind the mercantile. The sisters dismounted stiffly, every movement aching with sunburn and silence. Elias pushed open the tack room door. It smelled of horses and cedar. The walls were solid. The roof didn't leak. Ellie collapsed onto a blanket without a sound. June followed, dragging her feet. Clara lingered in the doorway. "What happened here?" she asked. Elias didn't answer right away. "A long time ago, I stopped a sheriff from hanging a Cheyenne elder. Said he was stealing cattle. What he was stealing was his own grandson, taken by settlers. I stepped in. Sheriff didn't take kindly." "Did you kill him?" Clara asked. Elias met her eyes. "I bled for it. Someone else did the killing." Outside, Boots passed in the alley. Clara flinched, but Elias didn't move, just placed his hat low over his brow and sat beside the door, rifle leaning against the wall. 2 blocks away, a man scribbled on parchment in the corner of the saloon, eyes sharp and ears open. He folded the note, sealed it, and handed it to a writer waiting outside. The dust hadn't even settled from Elias's return before it was kicked up again, this time heading east, toward men with bounties to claim and no questions to ask. Because bitter Mesa didn't forget, and neither did those who wanted him dead. The stars were out again, sharp and scattered like old bullet holes in the sky. Bitter Mesa had gone quiet, save for the occasional whinny from the stable and the soft whistle of wind through dry boards. Inside the tack room, Ellie slept curled against June, both girls finally still, their chests rising in rhythm, like they'd begun to breathe for each other. Clara stood outside the door, arms folded, watching Elias sit beneath the edge of the overhang. He hadn't spoken since they ate, hadn't touched the plate she handed him, just cleaned his rifle with the care of a man who expected to use it again before the week was out. "You gonna tell me why?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Why what?" "Why a man like you sticks his neck out for girls he don't know, shoots people, runs from the law, bleeds in the dirt for strangers." Elias ran the oiled cloth down the barrel one more time, slow and steady. "You want a noble answer?" "I want a true one." That earned her a glance, brief but direct. He set the rifle down across his knees, hands resting on either side like a prayer unspoken. "I had a sister," he said. "Leah." Clara's expression changed. "She was 14 the last time I saw her. We lived near Fort Keogh. Mama Cheyenne, Father White. Didn't belong anywhere. One winter, soldiers came through. Said they were looking for deserters. We opened the door. Thought they were there to trade. He paused. They took her. Clara swallowed. Did you go after them? I tried. Tracked them to a camp near the Platte. Found the wagon she was in. Empty. A merchant told me she'd been traded for whiskey and boots. Said she was pretty enough to get more. But the man was in a hurry. His voice didn't change. That was the part that made her chest ache. I spent 3 years chasing smoke, he said. Saloon to saloon, mining towns, ranch auctions. Asked enough questions to get shot at in 6 territories. Never found her. Clara lowered her gaze, the wind tugging a strand of hair across her face. I'm sorry. Elias nodded. Slow. Me too. She stepped closer, her voice quiet now. So when you heard Ellie crying in that boxcar, I heard Leah. He picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, then laid it beside him again. I didn't save you because I'm good. I did it because I couldn't walk away. Not again. Clara looked back at the tack room. She could still see Ellie's tiny form beneath the blanket, one hand resting on June's arm. Do they remind you of her? Elias shook his head. Number. They remind me what kind of man I swore I'd never be. The kind who leaves girls like that behind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara sat beside him, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the horizon. She still didn't trust him, but now she understood him. The first plume of dust rose just after midday, too wide to be a trader, too fast for cowhands. Elias stood on the roof of the stable, eyes narrowed beneath his brim, watching the horizon. He counted at least 10 riders. No wagons, no flags, just intent and speed. He climbed down, quiet and fast, boots hitting the dirt like a warning shot no one heard yet. They're coming, he said. Red stepped out of the livery, wiping grease from his hands. Traffickers? More than that. Hired guns, and one of 'em's riding too straight to be a drifter. Pinkerton? Elias nodded once. The name alone was enough to drain the color from Red's face. Pinkertons didn't take bounties, they took missions. Quiet ones, federal ones. Clara heard it from the alley and came running. How long? By nightfall, Elias said. Maybe sooner if they push the horses. She looked at him, jaw tight. You should run. I've done enough running. He turned to the street where the townsfolk had begun to gather. Farmers, blacksmiths, one preacher, 3 saloon girls, a pair of boys who looked too young to shave. They weren't soldiers. Hell, most had never held a rifle outside of deer season. Didn't matter. They'll burn this town to get what they want, Elias said loud enough for all to hear. But if we stand together, we can stop them. Red snorted. With what? Rusted shotguns and kitchen knives? With enough time to prepare, Elias said. A shovel's just as deadly. The townsfolk spread out. Doors slammed. Tools were grabbed. Windows were barricaded. Within an hour, Bitter Mesa looked less like a forgotten way station and more like a place ready to fight for its name. Elias found Clara behind the mercantile, showing June how to load a revolver. She was all grit and focus, her fingers trembling only once before she got the chamber to spin. I don't want to kill anyone, June said. Elias knelt beside her. You don't have to. But if a man walks through that alley with a rope in his hand and Ellie's name on his lips, you point this at his knees. Then you run. Clara handed him a rifle. I trust you know what you're doing. No, Elias said, but I've seen what happens when nobody does anything. That night he walked the town twice, placed lookouts on rooftops. dug shallow trenches at choke points, sharpened stakes from broken fence posts. When he passed the tack room, he saw Ellie kneeling by the fire pit, trying to strike flint the way he'd shown her. She looked up at him with the quiet pride of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of death. "Got it to spark," she whispered. He smiled for the first time. "Good," he said. "You'll need that spark." Because in the distance, the fire had already begun. The canyons south of Bitter Mesa had seen blood before. Comanche raids, border skirmishes, wagon ambushes left to be swallowed by the dust. But nothing like what came through Widow's Ridge that morning. Elias crouched behind a line of boulders, the barrel of his rifle resting steady on the stone. His side ached where the bullet had grazed him hours earlier, but he ignored it. Pain was simple, predictable. What wasn't predictable was how many men they'd brought. 14, at least. And one of them wore a gray suit and a Pinkerton badge that glinted like a snake's eye in the sun. Behind Elias, June breathed shallowly, her small fingers tight around the grip of the revolver he'd given her. Beside her, Clara held Ellie close, crouched low behind a cart they'd overturned for cover. The girl's hair was full of dust and gunpowder. Her lips moved without sound, prayers or numbers, no one knew. The first shot came from the ridge. A sharp crack, a whistle, and the sound of splintered wood. "Stay down!" Elias barked, already returning fire. The canyon erupted. Gunfire echoed off the stone walls, louder than thunder, louder than memory. Men shouted, horses screamed. The smell of blood and black powder hung heavy in the heat. Elias moved fast, reloading behind cover, his breath ragged. Another shot grazed his arm, this one deeper. His hand slipped in blood, and for a second the whole world tilted. He dropped behind a ledge and tried to breathe. June was screaming, "Elias!" But it wasn't fear, it was fury. She stood in the open, arms steady, her face set like iron. A man twice her size charged from the left, pistol raised. She fired once, missed, twice, hit. Third time, he fell, eyes wide, legs kicking in the dirt. She stared at the body, the revolver still smoking in her hand. And she didn't look away. Clara didn't have time to shout. A horse broke loose from the attacker's flank, wild-eyed, blood-flecked, and charging straight toward the ridge. Ellie had stumbled in the panic, crawling away from the wagon, lost in the dust. Clara ran without thinking, boots slipping on loose stone. She reached Ellie just in time to throw them both into the dirt as the horse thundered past, its hooves missing them by inches. Ellie sobbed into her sister's dress. "It's okay," Clara whispered, rocking her. "It's okay." By the time the gunfire slowed, there were 5 bodies in the canyon, and a silence so sharp it made Elias wince. Red smoke curled in the heat. The last attacker dropped his weapon and fled into the rocks, boots scraping like a ghost, trying to outrun judgment. The townsfolk emerged slowly, some wounded, all stunned. The girls gathered beside Elias. June helped him to his feet, her hands bloody but calm. Clara's face was streaked with soot and tears. Ellie clung to her sisters, eyes wide, but no longer afraid. They had survived, but they would never be the same. The courthouse in Prescott sat like a stone promise at the edge of town. Whitewashed walls, an iron bell that hadn't rung since the cholera scare, and windows too narrow to let in doubt. Elias Boon stood before the judge with shackles on his wrists and dried blood on his shirt. The wound in his side throbbed with each breath, but it was the silence in the room that hurt more. The crowd packed into the gallery wasn't just there to see justice. They were there to see if men like Elias, men who broke rules to save girls no one had noticed were missing, would ever be anything more than criminals in the eyes of a ledger. The prosecutor, a stiff man from Tucson with polished boots and no patience for poetry, called it clear-cut: theft of state-bound cargo, interference with federal commerce, homicide. Marshal Boon abandoned his badge, he said, turning to the jury, took 3 underage girls from a government-sanctioned transport and led an armed rebellion in Bitter Mesa that resulted in multiple deaths. These are not the actions of a lawman. These are the actions of a vigilante. He rested his case with the smugness of a man who had never seen a child sold. Then Clara Dunley stood. The judge asked her name. She gave it clearly. Clara Dunley, 20 years old, former schoolgirl from Missouri Territory, former prisoner in a boxcar. She stepped to the center of the floor, her voice neither loud nor soft, but sharp enough to cut through the air. "We weren't cargo," she said. "We were property, branded with paperwork and thrown in with manure like we were cattle. My little sister had a fever. My middle sister had bruises. I had nothing left in me to scream." The room was silent. "Elias Boon didn't kidnap us," she continued. "He rescued us. He didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because there wasn't a law worth trusting. Not one." The judge shifted in his seat. Red stood next, then the doctor, then 3 townsfolk who had taken up arms at Widow's Ridge. Each of them told the same story in different ways, about a man who didn't ask for thanks, who bled for strangers, who taught girls to shoot not to kill, but to survive. The Pinkerton agent never showed. By dusk, the judge leaned forward, eyes heavy. "In times like these," he said, "law and justice don't always wear the same face. Mr. Boon, you are free to go." The gavel struck. The room exhaled. Later that evening, in the warm light of the town hall, a clerk unfolded 3 papers. Clara, June, and Ellie stood in clean dresses borrowed from the church women. "Do you swear," the clerk asked, "to accept Bitter Mesa as your home? To live free and full, as citizens, not property?" Each girl nodded. "I do," Clara said. "I do," whispered June. Ellie just smiled. Outside, Elias watched through the window, hat in hand. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. They were no longer his to save. They were free. The porch creaked beneath their boots as the wind rolled in from the canyon, carrying the scent of mesquite and horses and the distant promise of rain. Clara Boon, now 27, leaned against the post with a quiet strength that hadn't come from years. It had come from survival. Her eyes, once guarded, now held calm. Not softness, just peace. Beside her, Elias sat in the old rocking chair. He'd patched 3 times over, hat tipped low, rifle resting just inside the door, not because he expected trouble, but because he still respected it. The land stretched wide in every direction, fenced, worked, and green in places that once only knew dust. A hand-dug well stood out back. 3 horses grazed by the creek, and above the gate, carved deep into cured wood, was a single name, Boon. Not for him, for all of them. Clara watched as June came up the trail on horseback, her long braid catching the wind, a saddlebag full of books bouncing at her side. She'd taken to teaching the children in Bitter Mesa, riding in twice a week and returning with ink on her fingers and ideas in her head. Her revolver still hung from her belt, not as a threat, but as a memory. Ellie ran to meet her, now 15 and too fast for her own good, wearing boots a size too big and freckles scattered across her face like stars. She grabbed the reins before June could dismount and led the horse to water like she'd been born doing it. "Girls are home," Clara said, sipping her coffee. Elias grunted in reply, the closest he ever came to smiling. She turned to him, resting her hip against the rail. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "No." "Ever wish we'd ended up somewhere else?" He looked at her then, really looked, and for a second, the lines on his face softened. "No." The sun dipped lower, painting the hills in gold. The scars on Elias's hands had faded to thin silver lines, but the ache in his ribs from Widow's Ridge still flared when the weather changed. He didn't complain. He never had. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the old flint he'd given Ellie years ago. She ran her thumb across it absently. "She still keeps this," she said. Elias nodded. "Told her she'd need a spark." "She became the spark," Clara said. A quiet settled between them. Not awkward, not empty. Just the kind that comes from people who've already said all the hard things and still come back each day to the same porch, the same land, the same family. Behind them, laughter rang out. Ellie's voice, June's teasing reply. Clara smiled. "They call you Papa, you know, when you're not listening." Elias didn't answer, just stared out at the fields, the shadows, the sky. But in the rhythm of the rocker beneath him, in the way he leaned back and breathed deep, she heard what he didn't say. He knew, and it was enough. If this story touched you, and you like this kind of story, subscribe and be here for the next one.